Masechet Baba Batra, Daf, Kof Dalid, Nu Mishnah, Bet Kod Afar Ani Mocher Lecha, Mida Bechevel, Pichet Kol Shehu Yenakeh, Hotir Kol Shehu Yachazir. If someone says, I'm going to sell you a plot of land that is the size of a bet kod, and it's going to be measured precisely with a rope. So he wants exactly a bet kod. He's going to sell precisely a bet kod, and the buyer then is also expecting precisely a bet kod. Now, if he delivers even a little bit less than a full bet kod, then the seller has to reduce the price by that much, however much it is, $10 less, $20 less. And if he gave a little bit more than exactly a bet kod, then the buyer has to return that land. Ve'im amar hen chased hen yater, afilu pichet roba lis'a o hotir roba lis'a, higi'o yoter mikan yaseh cheshbon. However, if the seller said, I'm going to sell you a bet kod of earth, less or more, whether a little less or whether a little more. He didn't say precisely as measured by a rope. In that case, even if the seller delivered a bet se'ah less a rova for each se'ah, a rova hakav, he gave a rova hakav less per se'ah that he sold, or up to that amount. That ratio is 1 out of 24. So as long as he gave him, let's say 1 out of 25, 1 out of 26, less than he was supposed to, or if he gave him more than the bet kod, and it was up to a rova per se'ah more, in that case, the sale is finalized. It's his. The buyer gets what he got, and he doesn't get money back. He doesn't have to give any land. He doesn't have to pay anything further. That's it. Because he said more or less. However, even more or less has limits. If the amount that it's off by is more than a rova hakav per every se'ah, more than that 1 out of 24, then they have to make a calculation, and it seems that once you make the calculation, then you're probably going to have to give the full amount. In other words, up to 1/24th, then the sale is final, no problem. But if it goes over 1/24th, then he'll have to pay back, whoever got more, will have to pay back the entire overage. All right, that's the beginning. Now, mahu machzir lo ma'ot. What does he return to him? Let's say the buyer got too much land. So does he have to return the land, or does he return the money? Who gets to decide? So right now we say he gets the money back. But if the seller wants, then he can demand the land. So basically it's up to the seller to decide if he would rather get more money from the seller, or for the amount that's over. This would be in a case where he said, I'm giving you precisely that measured by a rope, or if it was more than 1/24, if he didn't say that amount. So the seller has the right to decide, listen, I delivered to you too much, I want you to pay me. Or he could say, I want you to give back the extra land that I gave you. So why did they say, so how come it says, in the first statement it says ma'ot? You see, this is a complex Mishnah. First it says, what does he return? Money. And then it says, but if he wants, he can do land. So then why'd you say money in the first place? Okay, we said money in the first place to improve the power of the seller, that if he wants money, he can say, you have to pay me. I know I gave you extra land, but now that you got it, I want the money. In return, it's kind of forcing a sale. So the power, the choice goes to the seller. And we see this in practice in the following cases. Sheim shiyer besadeh bet tish'a kabin, ubagina bet hasikav, uchterbe bi akiba bet roba, machzir lo et akarka. So for example, if the amount that the seller gave that was too much was by a lot, and that land is usable, then the seller probably is going to want the land back because it's a large amount. So if he sold a lot of land, multiple se'ahs, and all together, let's say for every se'ah, there was a quarter of a kav extra. And so that it adds up to 9 kav. Okay, so he sold many of them, and all the extra little pieces add up to a lot. So 9 kav is considered the smallest amount in a field that is considered its own field, its own entity, that would be worth farming. So if it's less than 9 kav, then most people don't want to bother with it because it's just too small to use. But once it's 9 kav, probably the seller is going to say, I gave you all that extra, I want the whole thing back. That's for planting grain for a field. Regarding a garden for vegetables, vegetables, there, even smaller, even just a half a kav, can produce a lot of tomatoes, vegetables. According to Rabbi Akiva, it's even a rova hakav in a garden is already considered its own entity, and therefore we expect the seller would want the whole thing back. So in that case, the seller can say, oh look, it added up to a lot, something usable. Well, I want the land back. But if not, if it's less than that, then he'll probably say, you know what, just give me the money. What am I going to do with a little tiny piece of land? And now the Mishnah teaches that in a case where the overage went a quarter kav or more, in which case it triggers, in the second case where he said more or less, but even to say more or less, if it's under a quarter of a kav, then the sale goes through. If it's more than that, then he has to return the overage. So when you do that, not only do you have to return the rova hakav, but also all the extra over it. Now, as the Gemara is going to notice, really this should say the other way around. It should say, not only do you have to return the amount more than a quarter kav, that of course you have to return because that triggered the excess, and so you have to return that. But once you trigger that, then you have to return even the quarter kav itself. Even though if it did not go over a quarter, if it was exactly a quarter kav, then you wouldn't have to return anything, the sale would be final. But once it goes over that and it triggers the excess, then of course you have to return the excess and even the rova. So anyway, either way you have to return both, meaning you have to return the entire amount. Now the Gemara is going to ask, bet kor setama mai, regarding the distinction that we made in the beginning of the Mishnah. If you say a bet kor as measured by a rope, then it has to be precise. Any little bit more, a little bit less has to be returned. And if you say a bet kor more or less, well, then you have up to a rova hakav. The question is, what if you say bet kor? The seller just says, I'm selling you a bet kor. He didn't say precise. He didn't say more or less. He just didn't say anything. So which category will that fit into? Which law will prevail? Tashema. Bet kor afar ani mochel lecha bechebel. Pachot kol shehu yenake, yater kol shehu yachzir. Hasetama kehen chaser hen yater dameh. So if we focus on just the first case in the Mishnah, where the seller says, I'm selling you a bet kor precisely as measured with a rope, then if it was a little bit less or a little bit more, then you have to return that amount. He has to either pay or return that amount of land. So that would mean that in the case where you said precisely measured, then it's precise. But if you didn't say that phrase with a rope, then it would be the same as more or less. So in other words, if we only had the first clause, we would assume that anything different from that, that the law does not apply. So if you didn't say anything, it would be like more or less. But now let's focus just on the second case. If the seller says, I'm going to sell you a bet kor more or less, then you have a leeway of a quarter of a kav per se'ah, more or less, and the sale is final. So that means precisely in that case where you said more or less, that's when you have the leeway. Hasetama kemida bechebel dameh. But if you didn't say anything at all, then that would not be true, and it would be like if you said precisely measured. Ela mehalek ala mishma mina. So therefore, from our Mishnah, we cannot learn either way. If our Mishnah gave only one of the cases, then we can learn, precisely in that case, but not the other. But here, it's the excluded middle. It's the case that is not like the Resha, it's not like the Sefa, it's not like either of them, and you could infer opposite things if you focus on only one or the other. So our Mishnah is inconclusive. So let's try the following Baraita. Tashema. Bet kor afar ani mochel lecha, kebet kor afar ani mochel lecha, hen chaser hen yater ani mochel lecha. Afilu pichet roba lis'a, o tir roba lis'a, higi'ah. This Baraita presents three phrases, and we're going to have to figure out what is the relationship between these three. Are they three different cases, or is one explaining the other? So the first one says, I'm selling you a bet kor. That's stam. And then it says, kebet kor afad, kebet kor, about a bet kor. That's like a more or less. Or if he actually says more or less. In these three cases, even if it was a quarter less than it was supposed to be, or a quarter more than a sale that he said, the sale is final. What can we learn from here? Alma setama nameh kehen chaser hen yater dameh. That means that if you don't say anything at all, it's the same as saying ke, about that much, which is the same as saying explicitly more or less. So this is an explicit baraita that seems to definitely answer our question, but not so fast. We can interpret this baraita otherwise. Hatam perushe kamefaresh ezehu bet kor shehi כבית קוד, כגון דמלא hen chased hen yater. Maybe it's not three cases, but rather it's saying, where would you find a case where selling a bet cod actually is not precisely a bet cod, but is about a bet cod? Oh, it will be in a case where you said more or less. There's actually only one case here, and the Mishnah and the Braita is teaching that if you say more or less, then it's not precisely a bet cod, it's a bet cod. So it's a one whole sentence, right? When is a bet cod like a bet cod and not precisely a bet cod? When you say more or less. So maybe it's all talking about one case, and we cannot learn the stam from here. But this is not a good reading. Matkif la Rav Asher. Im ken ani mochel lecha lamali. Rav Asher says, well, then why would it say ani mochel lecha after each one? It would have just read bet kod afar kebet kod afad. When is a bet kod afad really about the size of a bet kod? Oh, it's when you say hen chasen yated ani mochel lecha. Then possibly you could read it that way. But from the fact that it says ani mochel lecha after each clause, it really reads better as three separate clauses, which definitely seems to be the peshat of this baraita. Rather, we in fact can conclude from this baraita that if you didn't say anything at all, just said, I'm selling you a bet cod, then it's the same as saying more or less. So really miraculously that we actually have an answer. Often when we have these kinds of dilemmas, we leave it open-ended. But here we have a clear baraita, and as much as we tried to reread the baraita, in fact is a good proof. מהו מחזיר לו מעות וכולי. לייפות כוחו של מוכר אמרינן, לייפות כוחו של לוקח לא אמרינן. So now we said that when he returns something, if in cases where he has to return it, it's up to the seller to say, oh, I gave you extra, I want money back. Or if he wants, he could say, oh, how much did I give you extra? Oh, a large amount that's usable? Well, then I want the land back. So why did we say money in the first place? To give extra power, to give the choice to the seller. So the principle in the Mishnah explicitly is that the seller has the upper hand. So now we ask, is that true? And the buyer doesn't have the upper hand? Look at the following baraita, where it's going to say the buyer also has some agency in deciding. Vehatanya, pichet shivat kabin umechasa lechor, o hatir shivat kabin umechasa lechor, higi o yoter mikan kofin et hamocher limkor vet halokeach likach. If someone delivered, in this case, they're not selling just a se'ah, but a cord, which is 30 times bigger than a se'ah. And it's off by 7.5 kav. So that is exactly 30 times a quarter kav, right? A quarter of 30 is 7.5. So this is actually the same ratio. It's 1 out of 24. So the case is precisely the same, even though we're talking about larger amounts. We just multiplied everything by 30. Okay, so if he says, I'm going to sell you a cord, and then he ended up delivering less than that, and it was less by 7.5, or more than that, and it was more by 7.5, if it was precisely that amount, or it was off by less, then the sale is final. But if he delivered too much more than 7.5 or less than 7.5, and the ratio was actually larger than 1 out of 24, then we force the seller to sell the extra land. Let's say he delivered extra. Then we tell the seller, okay, you delivered that much, you have to let him buy it, and we force the buyer to buy it. So we see over here that actually there is no choice, that the seller can't decide whatever he wants, but rather that we force the seller to sell the land, and the buyer also to buy it. So here we don't give a choice to the seller, and so the buyer has more power than what we thought before. So how can you reconcile this with the Mishnah? And the answer is Hatam kegon dehava yakira meikara vezal hashta damrinan le I ara yahabat li habli kezola dehashta. Oh, this baraita is talking about a case where the land was more expensive at the time of sale, and it got cheaper now that we realized that there was a surplus that was delivered, and we have to account for it. By this point, the value of the land went down. So we tell the seller in the name of the buyer, listen, seller, if you want me to keep the land, and it's extra land, so that the buyer has it, so the buyer can say, if the seller wants, he can take the land back. But the buyer says, listen, if you don't want the land back, and you want me to keep the land and pay for it, I'm not paying the original price that it was before. I'm paying the lower price. So that's the point of this baraita. In fact, in general, the seller can decide if he wants the land back or if he wants to get paid for the land. Yes, and even in this case, he can decide that. But the point of this baraita is that if he decides that he wants to get paid for the land, the price of the land will be the lower price, the current lower price, and he can't force the buyer to pay the higher price. He can force the buyer to pay for it, but not at the higher price, rather the lower price. Okay, so we resolve that one. But now we have yet one more baraita to reconcile. Hatanya, keshu noten lo kesha shelakach mimenu. We have another baraita that says when the buyer pays for that excess land, then he pays according to the market price at the time of the sale. So that is exactly the opposite of this answer that we just said. And we explained, Hatam kegon dava zola mekara veyakra lahashta. Oh, this baraita is talking about the opposite case, where it was cheaper beforehand and it went up in price in the meantime. And then the seller says, oh, I delivered too much land, and you know what? I want you to keep it and I want you to pay me for that extra land. The seller has a right. As we said before, the seller can choose whether he wants to take the land back or get paid for the extra land that he delivered. However, in this case, that the price went up, the buyer can say, listen, the price went up. I'm not paying you the higher price. I'm going to pay you the lower price as it was at the time of the sale. So in sum, the power always goes to the seller, meaning he has a choice. If too much was delivered, the seller can decide if he wants the land back or the money back. If he says, I want the money back, meaning I want you to pay for that extra land, then the buyer has a right to choose the lower of the two prices. The seller can force the buyer to buy it, but he can't force the buyer to buy it at a higher price, and so the buyer does have the benefit of the lower price, whether that was the original sale price or the current price if it went down. We now analyze the next section of the Mishnah that taught Im Shir Besadeh Betisha Kabin Vechule. The Mishnah said that the seller has the choice. If he delivered too much land, then he has a choice to say, listen, I delivered too much land, I want you to pay for it, I want the money. Or he can say, I want the land back. And the Mishnah continued and said, well, if he wants, usually he would want the money back if it's just a little bit. But if it's a large piece of land, a piece of land that is a separate entity that's worth farming on its own, that's when he can demand and say, listen, I want all of the land back because it adds up to a major amount of 9 kav. Now we're going to have a controversy about how to interpret this Mishnah. When it says 9 kav, is that a fixed amount or is it a ratio? So Amar Rav Huna, Tisha kabin shamru afilu bebik'a gedola. Rav Huna says it's a fixed amount, even if the sale is a large valley of many kod of land. By ratio, you can, even if you have a small amount of overage for each kod, nevertheless, it will altogether add up to 9 kav. So, Rav Huna says the 9 kav is an objective amount, it's a fixed amount, even if the ratio is actually less than 1 out of 24. Nevertheless, once it adds up to 9 kav, there the seller says, oh, look at all this overage, 9 kav of overage, that's significant in and of itself. Then he can say, okay, you have to pay me you have to give me the 9 kav of land because that's a whole field by itself, even if the ratio is less. But Rav Nachman Amar, noten shibat kabin umechesa lechol kor vekor, v'iika milta yetera dahave litishat kabin hadri. Whereas Rav Nachman says that the seller needs to give 7.5 kav for every kor. That's the ratio of 1 out of 24. So if he gave an overage of up to that amount, then the sale is final and he cannot ask for anything back. However, if there is more than that, if the ratio is more than 1 out of 24, then he can get back anything that's more if it's 9.5 kav. In other words, once you go over the ratio, and it does depend on the ratio. So in the case of this large valley that he gave with many kav, cord, but if the ratio is small, then that's it. The sale is final. However, once it goes over the ratio and also the amount of land all put together is 9 kav, then the seller says, "Oh, I want it returned." He can get everything returned, and he can demand the land if he decides that he wants the land back. Okay, good. So that is machloket. Now we're going to challenge Rav Nachman, who said that it's the ratio. Itibe Rava leRav Nachman. Shim shier besadeh bet tishat kabin. Lav dezaben le koraim. And Rava's question is from the Mishnah itself, because the Mishnah says if the overage was 9 kav regarding a field. So when it says 9 kav, doesn't that mean 9 kav objectively, no matter how much the sale is? And even if it's 2 kod, still it's 9 kav. It's an objective amount. And he answers, no, la dezaben le kor. No, the Mishnah is giving an example of 9 kav, assuming that the whole sale was a kor. So 9 kav per kor. That's what it was saying. It does go by ratio. Then that's already over the 7.5. That's why it goes back. But it all goes by ratio. If it was 2 kod, then 9 kav would be less, and the sale would be final. Okay, the next question also from the Mishnah. Ubagina bet hasi kav. Mishnah said regarding a garden where you can plant a whole garden in less space, less of it is usable, then it's only a chatsi kav is the cutoff amount. Lav dezaben le satayim. So doesn't this mean an objective amount? Even if the full sale of the land is a lot, even if it's 2 se'ah or more, and we answer la dezaben le se'ah. And Rav Nachman can say, no, the Mishnah is assuming a case where the entire sale was 1 se'ah. So a 24th of that is a quarter of a kav. And so if the seller gave a half a kav too much of that entire sale, that's clearly triggers, it's over the minimum of the quarter kav, which is now it's already too much. And so something has to be given back. And since it's a chasi kav, which is significant in and of itself to make a garden, so the seller can say, I want the entire land back. But in fact, if the entire sale was 2 se'ah, well then a half a kav would be precisely at the cutoff point, but wouldn't trigger the cutoff point. And in that case, the sale actually would be final, and the buyer would not have to return anything at all. And so, similar question about the next measurement. So when Rabbi Akiva says, even a bet rova for a garden is a significant area, and the seller can say, I want the entire land back. So isn't this talking about a case where the whole sale was a se'ah, and yet a quarter triggers it? So that means that a bet rova is a fixed amount no matter what. And so a bet rova will have to be returned no matter what the ratio is, right? Isn't that right? And this is la dezaben le chasi se'ah. No, in this case, it's not a bet rova within a se'ah, which is much less than the amount that's a 1/48th. No, the Mishnah is assuming a case where the full sale was half a se'ah, so a bet rova and half a se'ah is the same ratio of 1 out of 24, and that's the reason because this is exactly the cutoff, but let's say it was a little bit less, and so if it would trigger that cutoff, then if it was a bet rova or more, then you would have to return the entire land. The seller could demand the return of the entire land. Okay, so we answered all those questions. Now, Rav Ashe asks, what if this land that was sold originally was a field, but then it turned into a garden, or was a garden and it turned into a field? We saw that the minimum amounts of something significant for a field is 9 kav, but for a garden is only half of a kav. So if it was a field, but now it's a garden, and then we make the calculation after it changed into a garden, so do we say, well, it's less than 9, so he cannot demand the full land back? Or do we say, but it's more than half, and he can demand the land back? Or the other way around? Which definition would we follow? And we'll leave that question standing. Tana, if the excess land was right next to the land of the seller, right, that extra part that the seller delivered delivered actually was adjacent to the seller's own land. Even if it's a small amount, the buyer can return the land. Why? Because there's no downside to the seller in that case. The buyer's like, listen, I don't want to pay for more land. I bought a bedkod. I paid for a bedkod. I only want a bedkod. Now you have this excess land. The excess land is right adjacent to your field. So it's easy for you to just plow that whole thing. In that case, the seller does not have a choice. See, if that excess land is adjacent to the buyer's land and far away from the seller's land, then the seller's like, what am I going to do with the little piece of land that's far away from the rest of my land? No, you have to pay me for it. But if it's next to the seller's land, then the buyer can say, it's next to your land anyway, and I didn't want it. This was excess, I'm returning that land. Rav asks, what if, this excess land is near the seller's land, but there's a pit between them? Is that considered sufficient of an interposition that the buyer cannot force a return? Or do we say, oh, it's right near it. Okay, it's just a pit that's in the middle. Or what if it's a water channel that's between them? Or what if there's a highway between them? Or what if there's a row of palm trees between them? So all these things are different levels of interpositions, and so it's pretty nearby. But you can't really just take a plow and go right through it if there's something in between. On the other hand, it's not so far just to hop across and get there and tend to that area. So these questions are left standing. And finally, the Mishnah says that once it triggers the amount, you're allowed to go in excess up to a rova, but then more than that, you cannot. And then if you do trigger the past a rova of a kav more, then not only the rova do you have to return, but even the excess above the rova. So we say it should be the other way around. Taneh Rabin bar Nachman lo tamotar bilbad machzir lo ela et kol hareba'in kulan. So in fact, Rabin bar Nachman had another version of this Mishnah that in fact switched them around. Not only the excess above the quarter surplus does the buyer have to return, but also the basic amount of the quarter kav that is in excess he has to return. Even though if it didn't trigger that amount, then the buyer would keep the rova. But once it goes above a quarter, then he has to return, of course, everything above the quarter, but even that quarter itself. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.